Number 10. The stab-in-the-back myth in Germany. Some historical lies begin as crude propaganda and remain obviously false to anyone willing to look closely. The stab-in-the-back myth was more dangerous because it offered a wounded nation a story emotionally powerful enough to feel truer than reality. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the myth claimed that the army had not truly been beaten on the battlefield. Instead, it suggested that betrayal from within, by politicians, socialists, civilians, and especially groups already marked by prejudice, had robbed the nation of victory at the very moment it should have endured. That is what gave the lie its enduring force. Military defeat is humiliating. It demands reckoning with miscalculation, exhaustion, material collapse, strategic failure, and the limits of national power. The stab-in-the-back myth replaced all of that with something much easier to live with and much more poisonous to believe. It transformed defeat into theft. Once a nation accepts that it was not overcome by external force but sabotaged from inside, shame changes shape. It becomes grievance. And grievance is politically useful. That is why the myth did not remain an emotional rumor among embittered veterans. It was amplified by people who understood exactly what it could do. It delegitimized the Weimar Republic by linking civilian politics to treason. It reframed compromise as surrender and democracy as contamination. It redirected public anger away from military leadership and toward chosen internal enemies. In other words, the lie did not merely explain the past, it prepared the future. What makes this case especially dark is that the myth offered a total moral rearrangement of reality. The people responsible for leading Germany into catastrophe could present themselves as victims. Those trying to stabilize a broken nation could be cast as traitors. Jews, leftists, reformers, and Republican politicians could be placed inside a single narrative of internal corruption. The lie was broad enough to absorb many resentments at once, and that flexibility made it almost impossible to kill through facts alone. That is one reason it became so central to later extremism. A lie this useful does not fade when contradicted. It deepens when institutions, parties, and movements decide they need it. The stab-in-the-back myth gave German ultranationalism a story in which revenge felt moral, purges felt necessary, and democratic weakness could be blamed for a humiliation that had actually emerged from war itself. It was not just false, it was structurally perfect for radicalization. There is also something especially sinister about how the myth worked on memory. It did not ask people to deny suffering. It asked them to misplace its cause. People really had lost sons, status, certainty, and empire. The lie entered that pain and offered a human target. That is often how the most destructive falsehoods survive. They do not invent emotion from nothing. They hijack real emotion and redirect it toward the people power most once blamed. In the end, the stab-in-the-back myth belongs on this list because it shows how a defeated society can be prepared for future ruin by a lie that turns responsibility inward toward scapegoats rather than upward toward truth. It did not simply distort history, it weaponized memory itself. And once that happened, the lie no longer needed to prove anything. It only needed to keep telling the wounded that their pain had enemies close at hand. Number 9. The blood libel myth. Some historical lies are tied to one war, one crisis, or one political regime. The blood libel is darker because it endured for centuries, crossing borders, generations, and legal systems, while repeatedly turning minority existence into supposed evidence of hidden evil. The lie claimed that Jews kidnapped and murdered Christian children for ritual purposes, especially involving blood. It was baseless from the beginning, but it survived because it offered frightened or hateful societies one of the most powerful stories imaginable. Not that the outsider was merely different, but that the outsider was secretly monstrous. That is what made the blood libel so effective and so lethal. It did not accuse a community of political error or ordinary crime. It accused them of sacred corruption, of crimes against innocents so emotionally shocking that rational scrutiny became harder to sustain. A society can debate taxes, law, or custom. It is much less able to remain calm once children, murder, and ritual desecration are bound together in one accusation. The lie was built to overwhelm proportion, and once it entered religious and civic life, it became more than rumor. It became a recurring script. A child disappeared or died. Fear spread. Local authorities, clergy, or agitators framed the loss through the old accusation. Witnesses emerged. Confessions were extracted. Shrines, stories, and local cults sometimes formed around the alleged victim. Violence followed, the pattern repeated, because the lie was not only believed, it was institutionally available, ready to be activated whenever power, panic, or prejudice needed a story. What makes the blood libel especially revealing is that it survived despite repeated refutation. Church officials, rulers, and investigators in various times and places sometimes rejected specific cases. Facts often collapsed under scrutiny. That did not matter enough. The lie was too useful because it turned religious anxiety and social tension into moral permission for persecution. It could justify mob violence, expulsions, torture, confiscation, segregation, and the wider idea that Jewish communities represented an invisible threat hiding under ordinary life. That hiddenness is central to its power. The blood libel did not merely say the minority was wrong, it said the minority was disguising evil beneath normal appearance. That is one of history's most dangerous narrative structures. Once a lie teaches people that the enemy looks ordinary but commits secret horrors, every denial becomes suspicious, and every lack of proof becomes further proof of successful concealment. At that point, the accusation starts reproducing itself. There is also something especially horrifying about how the myth manipulated innocence. Dead children became raw material for hate. Grief became a weapon. Communities already in pain were offered a theatrical enemy upon whom sorrow and rage could be concentrated. That is often how powerful lies survive longest. They enter the most sacred parts of emotional life and turn them into engines of persecution. In the end, the blood libel belongs on this list because it reveals one of the oldest and ugliest mechanisms of power. The creation of a myth so morally inflammatory that it can repeatedly justify cruelty while pretending to defend the innocent. It was never true, but it was useful to those who needed fear, confiscation, exclusion, and violence to feel righteous. That is why the lie lasted so long. It did not merely deceive, it gave hatred a sacred costume and told whole societies to kneel before it. Number 8. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident Narrative. Some historical lies are forged slowly, layer by layer, until they become tradition. The Gulf of Tonkin narrative became dangerous with terrifying speed. In 1964, reports about attacks on U.S. naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin were presented in a way that made escalation in Vietnam appear necessary, urgent, and justified. The key problem was not simply confusion in the fog of military events. It was the way uncertainty and ambiguity were converted into political certainty, powerful enough to move a nation toward deeper war. That is what gave the lie its force. War needs stories the public can understand quickly. A country is far more likely to accept escalation if it believes its forces were clearly attacked and that the response is defensive rather than chosen. The Gulf of Tonkin narrative supplied exactly that. It compressed a complex and questionable situation into a clean moral frame. Aggression had occurred, the United States had been wronged, and firm action now followed as the natural consequence. What makes this case especially dark is how much depended on presentation. Signals, interpretations, battlefield confusion, intelligence uncertainty, and contested evidence all belong to the messy reality of military history. But power often does not want mess. It wants a sentence strong enough to survive a headline. Once the story was shaped into a convincing act of enemy aggression, The public space for doubt narrowed immediately. Questioning no longer felt like caution. It started to look like weakness. That is why the incident mattered far beyond the waters where it supposedly occurred. It gave political leadership a usable event, one that could be placed before Congress and the public, as proof that stronger military action was justified. The result was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a document whose consequences reached far beyond the original claims. This is one of the darkest features of political lies. The narrative may be compact, but the machinery it activates can be enormous. And because the lie operated through official framing rather than cartoonish fabrication alone, it became especially durable. People trust governments in moments of national security more readily than in many other contexts. The public often assumes that leaders possess clearer intelligence, broader perspective, and a better grasp of what is at stake. That trust becomes dangerous when uncertainty is being shaped into persuasion. A doubtful event can be made to sound decisive simply by being narrated with enough authority. There is also something especially revealing here about the relationship between truth and speed. War narratives often work best when they move faster than scrutiny. Once the emotional and political momentum begins, later corrections struggle to matter as much as the original impression. By the time deeper questions emerge, troops are deployed, policies are hardened, and the moral structure of the conflict has already been built in millions of minds. The lie wins by arriving first and sounding clear. In the end, the Gulf of Tonkin narrative belongs on this list because it shows how power can turn ambiguity into authorization. It did not need a perfect fabrication. It only needed a version of events strong enough to make escalation feel inevitable. And once that happened, history was forced to live with the consequences of a truth whose usefulness mattered more than its honesty ever did. Number 7. The weapons of mass destruction. Case for Iraq. Some historical lies justify persecution. Others justify invasion. The Iraq WMD case is one of the clearest modern examples of powerful institutions taking fear, intelligence claims, selective evidence, and political urgency and shaping them into a public certainty strong enough to support war. The claim was devastatingly simple. Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and represented a danger serious enough that waiting was unacceptable. That simplicity is exactly what made it effective. That is what gives the case its historical weight. A war argument does not need to persuade everyone equally. It only needs to create a moral atmosphere in which action feels more responsible than restraint. The WMD narrative did that by linking hidden weapons, catastrophic possibility, and the language of prevention. Once people are told that an enemy may possess terrible weapons and that delay could multiply the danger, doubt becomes emotionally difficult. Skepticism starts to feel reckless. What makes this case especially disturbing is how heavily it relied on the prestige of expertise. Intelligence assessments, official briefings, government statements, international presentations, and media repetition all contributed to the impression that this was not propaganda in the crude sense, but verified threat analysis. That matters because lies become most powerful when they can borrow the voice of institutions people are trained to trust. The public does not feel manipulated, it feels informed, and yet beneath that authoritative surface lay a structure of distortion, weak evidence treated as strong, contradictory evidence minimized, ambiguous material presented with exaggerated confidence, and worst-case assumptions framed as near certainties. The story did not survive because the proof was overwhelming. It survived because the political need for the proof was overwhelming. Once war becomes the desired outcome, intelligence can begin behaving less like restraint and more like raw material for narrative. That is why the Iraq case belongs on this list so high. It reveals a modern form of the same old pattern. A lie does not have to be invented out of nothing. It can be assembled from fragments, anxieties, partial truths, and suggestive language until it becomes more persuasive than reality. The phrase "weapons of mass destruction" did immense work, because it did not just describe an alleged arsenal. It activated a post-9/11 moral and emotional landscape in which invisible threat already felt close. There is also something especially chilling about how the narrative used time. The public was told, in effect, that uncertainty itself was a reason to strike. If the danger was hidden, if the weapons might be moved, if the attack could come later, then hesitation looked like irresponsibility. That temporal pressure is one of power's most effective tools. It can make incomplete evidence feel sufficient by insisting that waiting for stronger evidence would be foolishly late. And once the war began, the lie's consequences became enormous and durable. Lives were lost, states destabilized, violence multiplied, and the region was reshaped by a justification that later scrutiny could not undo. This is one of the darkest truths about political falsehood. Exposure after the fact may repair the historical record somewhat, but it does not resurrect the dead or reverse the chain reactions already unleashed. In the end, the WMD case for Iraq belongs here because it shows how modern power manufactures war-ready truth, not always through one forged document or one dramatic fabrication, but through the organized elevation of suspicion into certainty. The lie did not merely mislead. It created the moral atmosphere in which invasion could be sold as duty. And once that atmosphere hardened, the truth never had the same speed, scale, or institutional force to compete. Number 6. The Dreyfus treason narrative. Some historical lies become powerful because they flatter a nation's fears. The Dreyfus narrative became deadly because it allowed a state to turn its own prejudice into evidence. When French army officer Alfred Dreyfus was accused of treason in the 1890s, the case did not remain a narrow legal question for long. It became a national drama in which forged documents, institutional pride, anti-Semitism, and the fear of internal betrayal fused into a truth many powerful people found too useful to surrender. That is what gave the lie its force. France was already wounded by military humiliation and political instability. In that atmosphere, the idea that a Jewish officer inside the army had sold secrets to Germany satisfied several appetites at once. It promised explanation for national vulnerability. It offered the public a visible traitor, and it allowed the military establishment to defend its own prestige by insisting that the right man had already been found. Once those needs converged, the accusation stopped functioning as a normal claim. It became an institutional necessity. What makes the Dreyfus case especially disturbing is how quickly the machinery of proof bent to protect the narrative rather than test it. Documents were misread, forged, and manipulated. Doubt was treated as disloyalty. The court did not simply make an error in good faith. Powerful figures helped preserve the accusation because admitting its falsehood would have exposed something even more threatening to them, that the army, the state, and respected authorities had condemned the wrong man for reasons tied to prestige and prejudice rather than truth. That is why the lie survived so stubbornly even after evidence began pointing elsewhere. Once a falsehood becomes central to institutional honor, it acquires defenders who no longer need to believe it purely on the facts. They need it because retreat would be humiliating. In the Dreyfus affair, anti-Semitism made that retreat even harder. The false accusation did not stand alone. It rested on a wider social willingness to imagine Jewish disloyalty as plausible, hidden, and corrosive. The lie felt true to those already trained to see certain people as suspect, and that is one of the darkest parts of the whole story. The Dreyfus narrative shows how a lie can survive not by overcoming prejudice, but by riding directly on top of it. The public did not need perfect evidence because it had a ready-made emotional structure into which the accusation fit. A traitor was wanted. A Jewish officer could be imagined as one. The institution said it was so. That combination made the lie heavy enough to crush law. There is also something deeply modern about the case. This was not a medieval blood accusation or a primitive panic. It happened inside a state that considered itself advanced, legal, and rational. That matters because it strips away the comforting illusion that lies flourish only in obviously backward settings. The Dreyfus affair shows the opposite. A society with courts, newspapers, officers, experts, and national ideals can still decide that preserving authority matters more than preserving truth. That is why the affair became so explosive once resistance formed. The lie had been made official, but official truth is not the same as reality. Writers, investigators, politicians, and citizens who refused the false narrative had to confront not just a wrongful conviction, but the whole moral structure keeping it alive. The battle was never only about Dreyfus. It was about whether a state could admit that its own truth had been built from bias and fear. In the end, the Dreyfus treason narrative belongs on this list because it reveals how power can turn prejudice into judicial fact and then defend that fact long after it begins to crack. The lie did not only ruin one man's life, it exposed how fragile truth becomes when institutions decide that reputation is worth more than justice. Number 5. The Zinoviev letter scandal. Some historical lies justify war, others are built for a more surgical purpose, to poison politics at exactly the right moment. The Zinoviev letter scandal is one of the clearest examples. In 1924, just before a British general election, a letter surfaced supposedly written by Grigory Zinoviev, a senior Soviet figure encouraging British communists to intensify subversive work and exploit improved relations between Britain and the Soviet Union. The timing was almost too perfect. That should have been a warning. Instead, for many, it became immediate confirmation of what they were already prepared to fear. That is what gave the scandal its force. The letter did not need to invent British anxiety about communism. It only needed to activate it. Political lies work best when they arrive disguised as revelation rather than invention. The Zinoviev letter seemed to expose a hidden truth lurking beneath diplomacy, that normal political engagement with the Soviet Union was not statesmanship at all, but dangerous naivety in the face of revolutionary manipulation. Once framed that way, the document became more than a piece of correspondence. It became a weapon against opponents at home. What makes this case so revealing is its precision. Unlike broader myths that grow over decades, this lie had immediate tactical value. It entered public life at a moment when timing mattered, when fear could still influence votes, reputations, and the emotional climate of the election. That is one of the most effective forms of political falsehood, the kind that does not need to last forever to do permanent damage. It only needs to arrive before the truth is ready. And because it bore the shape of documentary evidence, the letter carried a special authority. People are often more vulnerable to lies when they appear as text, memo, leaked file, intercepted message, something concrete enough to satisfy the modern hunger for proof. A rumor can be dismissed. A letter looks official. It creates the illusion that the lie has already done the hard work of verification for you. The public is not being asked to speculate. It is being shown what seems like the hidden document itself. That is why later doubts struggled against the initial impact. Once a false document enters political life under conditions of urgency, its effect can far outpace any subsequent correction. Even if later analysis undermines authenticity, the emotional work has been done. People remember the charge, the scandal, the atmosphere of exposure. The falsity arrives second, slower, and less dramatically. In historical memory, this is one of the great advantages of politically useful lies. They do not have to endure unchanged forever. They only have to win first. There is also something especially telling here about how power and media interact. A forged or dubious text on its own is inert. It needs channels willing to amplify it, readers willing to interpret it as revelation, and political actors willing to let it do the work they need done. The Zinoviev letter scandal was not just about one document. It was about the conditions that allowed a suspicious text to become public truth at the exact moment it could alter national political life. In the end, the Zinoviev letter belongs at number 5 because it shows how a lie can be engineered not as a grand worldview, but as a perfectly timed intervention. It did not need centuries of repetition or deep mythic structure. It only needed fear, plausibility, and a political system ready to weaponize both. That is what makes it so chilling. The lie was brief in one sense, but its usefulness was enough to bend the democratic atmosphere when it mattered most. Number 4. The Reichstag fire as Nazi justification. Some historical lies are invented on paper. The Reichstag fire became more dangerous because it fused a real event with a manipulated meaning. In February 1933, the German Parliament building burned, and almost immediately the fire was framed by the Nazis as proof of a vast communist threat requiring emergency action. That is what made the case so powerful. The regime did not need to invent flames. It needed to control what the flames meant. That is one of the darkest advantages power can have. A forged document can be challenged. A visible disaster is harder to escape emotionally. People saw destruction. They saw smoke, ruin, and national shock. In moments like that, fear becomes available for rapid political use. The public wants explanation before it wants nuance. The regime understood that perfectly. By presenting the fire as the opening move in a larger communist assault, the Nazis converted uncertainty into permission. And permission was the real goal. The fire mattered not only as spectacle, but as a gateway. Once the event was interpreted as evidence of imminent revolutionary danger, emergency measures no longer looked authoritarian. They looked defensive. Civil liberties could be suspended, arrests could multiply, political enemies could be crushed, institutions could be bent under the excuse that the nation was under attack. This is how some of history's most effective lies work. They do not merely distort one event. They create the moral climate in which repression feels reasonable. What makes the Reichstag case especially disturbing is that ambiguity itself became part of the weapon. The full truth of who was responsible and how the fire unfolded has remained debated in various ways, but the Nazi regime did not need final historical certainty. It needed immediate public certainty. That difference matters. Truth unfolds slowly. Power can move faster. Once the official story of communist conspiracy was installed, the machinery of the state began acting on it before doubt could organize itself into resistance. There is also something especially chilling about how well the lie fit what many people were already prepared to fear. Political violence, instability, and anti-communist panic were not imaginary conditions in Weimar Germany. The regime did not have to create anxiety from nothing. It had to seize it, intensify it, and point it. That is often the most effective form of political falsehood. It does not replace reality completely. It colonizes reality's most volatile emotions and gives them a direction useful to those in power. That is why the Reichstag fire belongs so high on this list. It shows how a regime can take one dramatic event and turn it into an instrument for dismantling the future. The lie did not simply say who burned a building. It said what kind of nation Germany now was, what kind of enemies it faced, and what kind of government response must therefore follow. In that sense, the fire became a hinge. The narrative built around it helped swing an entire society deeper into dictatorship. In the end, the Reichstag fire as Nazi justification reveals one of the most terrifying patterns in political history: the exploitation of crisis to make repression feel like salvation. The building burned once. The lie built from it kept burning through institutions long afterward. Number 3, the Remember the Main war narrative. Some historical lies survive because they justify repression at home. Others are built to push a nation toward war. The Remember the Main narrative became one of the most famous examples. After the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, killing American sailors, the disaster was rapidly framed in public discourse as evidence of hostile Spanish action. That interpretation fed a powerful emotional slogan, "Remember the Maine," and helped turn grief, anger, and sensational reporting into moral momentum for war. That is what gave the lie its force. Naval explosions are technically complex events, but war narratives do not need technical complexity. They need outrage made clear enough to carry a flag. The destruction of the Maine provided a shocking image and a dead crew. Once those facts were linked to the idea of Spanish aggression, the event stopped being a tragedy awaiting careful investigation. It became a rallying cry. The public no longer faced an unresolved explosion. It faced an insult demanding response. And that transformation matters because it shows how quickly uncertainty can be militarized. The actual cause of the blast was not established with the kind of clarity the public story implied. But public emotion rarely waits for forensic caution when newspapers, politicians, and war sentiment converge. Remember the Maine worked not because it proved anything beyond dispute, but because it simplified grief into accusation and accusation into patriotic duty. What makes this case especially revealing is the role of media amplification. Sensationalist journalism helped create a climate in which suspicion hardened faster than evidence. A dramatic event, repeated in headlines and framed through outrage, can become emotionally true before it becomes historically true. That is one of the oldest and most dangerous relationships between power and communication. The narrative does not need to withstand later scrutiny if it can dominate the present long enough to shape action. There is also something important here about emotional legitimacy. People really were dead. National sorrow and anger were real. That is often what gives a war lie its deepest hold. It does not invent the pain, it redirects it. The sailors become not only victims of an explosion, but symbols in a story that power once told a certain way. Once that happens, questioning the narrative can begin to feel like disrespect for the dead rather than caution about the living. That is why the Remember the Maine case belongs this high on the list. It demonstrates how a nation can be pushed toward conflict through a false or exaggerated certainty attached to one explosive event. The slogan did immense work because slogans compress complexity into memory. They make doubt look weak and action look pure. By the time later reinterpretations complicate the original claim, the war atmosphere has already done its job. In the end, the Remember the Maine narrative reveals how power turns disaster into direction. A ship explodes. The public demands meaning. Powerful voices provide it fast enough, loudly enough, and morally enough that the truth becomes less important than the use. And once the lie is fused to patriotic emotion, history has to spend decades undoing what a few charged words accomplished almost immediately. Number 2. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Some historical lies survive for years. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion survived because it was built to function as a total explanation for fear itself. Presented as if it were the secret record of a Jewish plot for world domination, the text offered readers something far more powerful than a single accusation. It offered a complete conspiracy map: finance, revolution, media, moral decline, political unrest, war, social disorder. Everything could be folded into one story. That is what made it so devastating. It did not merely tell people who to hate. It taught them how to reinterpret the whole world as proof that the hatred was justified. That is what gives the Protocols such extraordinary historical darkness. A lie this effective does not need strong evidence because it is designed to absorb contradiction. If society is stable, the plot is working quietly. If society is unstable, the plot is accelerating. If Jews deny the accusation, denial becomes part of concealment. If evidence exposes the text as fraudulent, believers can simply say that powerful conspirators are covering their tracks. This is one of the most lethal properties a lie can possess: self-sealing logic. Once people accept the frame, almost nothing can get them out of it. And the text's origins only sharpen the horror. It was a fabrication, drawing heavily on earlier political satire and conspiracy material repurposed into an anti-Semitic weapon. That matters because the Protocols were not born from misunderstanding alone. They were manufactured. The lie was assembled, shaped, and circulated for use. It entered a world already full of anti-Semitic suspicion and offered exactly the kind of forged certainty that prejudice loves most, the illusion of hidden documentation. A rumor can feel unstable. A secret text feels like revelation. What makes this case especially chilling is the scale of its afterlife. The protocols did not remain a local forgery. They moved across countries, languages, and political systems, repeatedly reappearing wherever power wanted to transform social fear into a personalized enemy. The text became a portable engine of paranoia. It could be inserted into moments of revolution, financial crisis, moral panic, nationalism, or authoritarian mobilization, and still perform the same work, explain everything through a hidden Jewish hand. That is why it became so useful to extremists, especially in the 20th century. The lie turned anti-Semitism from scattered prejudice into what looked like a theory of history. Instead of saying, "We dislike this group," it said, "This group secretly controls the forces that make the world unstable." That is an immeasurably more dangerous form of falsehood because it does not merely encourage discrimination. It justifies permanent suspicion, endless persecution, and eventually exterminatory logic. If the enemy is not only present but globally hidden, then compromise becomes impossible by design. There is also something uniquely modern about the protocols. Earlier lies often depended on miracle stories, local rumor, or sacred accusation. This one mimicked bureaucratic revelation. It looked like minutes, plans, internal documents, the kind of thing modern people are trained to trust. That pseudo-documentary form gave the lie tremendous power in an age obsessed with systems, institutions, and hidden power. The forgery pretended to show the machine behind events. People wanted hidden order, and the lie gave them one. In the end, the protocols of the Elders of Zion belong at number 2 because they represent one of history's most catastrophic examples of fabricated truth. This was not only a lie about one event, it was a lie designed to reorganize how millions of people interpreted reality itself. And once that kind of falsehood is believed, it does not just distort the past. It creates a future in which hatred can always claim it is acting in self-defense against an enemy it invented. Number 1. The donation of Constantine. Some historical lies ignite quickly and violently. The donation of Constantine is darker in a slower, deeper way. It did not merely justify one panic, one purge, or one war. It helped shape centuries of political and religious authority by claiming that the Roman Emperor Constantine had granted sweeping temporal power to the papacy. The document presented itself as ancient imperial truth. In reality, it was a forgery. But for a long time, it was useful enough, authoritative enough, and institutionally valuable enough to help transform falsehood into governance. That is why it stands at number 1. The donation reveals perhaps the most unsettling form a historical lie can take. Not a sudden inflammatory accusation, but a forged foundation. Once a false document enters the bloodstream of institutions and begins supporting claims about who has the right to rule, judge, intervene, or inherit legitimacy, the lie becomes far more than propaganda. It becomes architecture. People do not merely cite it. They build worlds on top of it. What gave the forgery such force was its perfect fit with institutional desire. A document claiming imperial transfer of power to the papacy was not useful because people were stupid. It was useful because it solved problems. It gave sacred authority a legal-seeming historical basis. It allowed claims of political reach to appear ancient rather than opportunistic. It made contested power look inherited and divinely aligned. In other words, it did what the most effective lies always do. It arrived exactly where authority needed a story that would strengthen what it already wanted. And because it wore the shape of documentary antiquity, it had extraordinary durability. The old world respected texts, lineage, precedent, and the authority of inherited forms. A forged revelation from the age of Constantine could therefore do immense work. The lie did not need to persuade through emotional shock alone. It persuaded through historical prestige. It told rulers, clergy, and populations that the present order had roots in the earliest Christian empire itself. Once that kind of continuity is granted, resistance becomes harder. To challenge the claim is no longer merely to challenge policy. It is to challenge sacred history. What makes the donation especially haunting is how long it mattered before humanist criticism and philological analysis exposed it more decisively. That delay reveals something profound about power and truth. Falsehood does not survive only because evidence is absent. It survives because many institutions benefit from not looking too closely. A lie that flatters authority is often allowed to age into tradition. By the time it is challenged, entire systems may have already been shaped by it. There is also something symbolically perfect about this case for the theme of your video. The donation of Constantine was not merely a mistaken belief. It was a crafted instrument that blurred spiritual and temporal power in ways with vast historical consequences. It demonstrates how a false text can sit quietly inside legitimacy for generations, influencing political imagination, jurisdiction, and hierarchy, while appearing to be nothing more than ancient truth finally preserved. That is one of the most dangerous kinds of lie imaginable, the kind that stops sounding like a claim and starts sounding like history itself. And even when exposed, such lies do not simply vanish. Their institutional effects linger. The forgery may be unmasked, but the world built while it was believed does not evaporate overnight. That is what makes this case darker than a scandal alone. It shows that falsehood can help lay down real roads of power, and that later correction, however important, arrives long after the lie has already done civilizational work. In the end, the donation of Constantine belongs at number 1 because it captures the deepest truth in this entire video. The most powerful historical lies are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they are the ones written quietly enough, early enough, and usefully enough to become part of the foundations people stop thinking to question. A forged document claimed to tell the truth about authority, and for centuries much of history behaved as though it did.